All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Really appreciate you coming out. So, for those who don't know, my name is Richard King. I'm the president of the Tri-State Railway Historical Society, and I'm pleased to be our presenter tonight, giving out my presentation called Delaware Northern Rails, Rust, and the Catskills. This is a presentation I've wanted to do for a while, so finally gave myself the motivation to put it together. Um, so, I hope you certainly enjoy it. The Delaware Northern Railroad was a little short line that operated in the Catskills for 37 years from 1904 to 1942 when the rails were torn up. Most of the main line is now beneath the Pepacton Reservoir, uh, just west of Margaretville and Downsville, New York. It was a really interesting short line. It started out with much grander ambitions than what it turned out to be. So um, looking forward to sharing kind of its story with you. And I'm actually tuning into you tonight from Delaware County. Anyone who knows me knows I have a long affinity and attachment to the Catskills. My family has property up here, has been coming up here basically all of my life at this point. So matching my affinity for the Catskills with my love of railroads, the Delaware Northern was certainly a good fit. So let's get started. So Delaware County in upstate New York is a mountainous, rural, and sparsely settled. It's named Delaware County because it contains the headwaters of the Delaware River. Actually, the headwaters of the East Branch of the Delaware River are about quarter mile from where I'm sitting right now. The two main valleys in the county were formed by the West Branch of the Delaware River, which starts up here in Stamford, and the East Branch, which starts near Grand Gorge, which is where I am right now. The two river branches each form their own valley. Here, the West Branch, and then here the East Branch, and they come together here in Hancock, New York, on the Pennsylvania border, and then continue their way south down to Delaware Bay. The county is on the western edge of the Catskill Mountains and is defined by its rolling hills, valleys, and hollows, and rocky soil. The popular saying up here is that there are two rocks for every dirt, and having dug up on my own property many times, I can assure you that that is indeed the case. Delaware County is quite large. It's slightly larger than the state of Rhode Island. Our sheriff's department actually up here is like less than a dozen people, and they're responsible for, a state's worth of land. Um, but its year-round population has been consistently about 44,000 people since the days of the Civil War. The county was formed in 1797 and was mainly settled by Dutch and New Englander families in the years after the American Revolution. For decades after the American Revolution, dairy was the county's biggest industry, with farms and creameries throughout. Lumbering, cut stone, and wood acid were also some of the other big industries. Nowadays, there's a lot of cottage industries. There's like a lot of local breweries up here. There's still a lot of farming up here. Still very rural. A lot of second homeowners come up here from the city, Long Island and New Jersey. Still immensely beautiful and a lot of untouched land up here. Delaware County was served by several railroads. The Erie Railroad skirted the southwestern edge. So that is this line here along the Delaware between Long Eddy and Deposit. So here's Deposit, Long Eddy's down here. The Delaware and Hudson ran along the Susquehanna River on the county's western border. So it kind of dipped in and out of Delaware County between Sydney up through Oneonta and beyond. The New York, Ontario, and Western Railway, which is the shirt I'm wearing right now, passed through the county kind of on a circuitous route here. This is the O&W, and then here's the Delhi branch of the O&W that went up to the county seat. And then there was also the Ulster and Delaware Railroad that went through the northeastern part of the county up to Oneonta. The last of Delaware County's railroads to be built was the Delaware and Northern Railroad, which is this orange line here that wound its way up the East Branch Valley of the Delaware between East Branch, New York, and Arkville, New York, with a 9-mile branch up to Andes, which is the topic of tonight's presentation. So the D&N was an obscure little railroad in as much that it ran from one small dot on the map, East Branch, to another, Arkville. In his history of the O&W, William Helmer referred to it as a transportation anachronism, meaning it has long outlasted its era. Locals referred to it as the damn nuisance, and that was also the title of Harry Archer's book, which was the first book on the subject, published in the 1970s. It was called that for its frequent derailments and the anxieties it caused the city of New York for the better part of 2 decades when the city of New York was looking to build a reservoir in the East Branch Valley. The 38-mile main line, which connected the O&W Railway at East Branch and the Catskill Mountain branch of the New York Central, was built between 1904 and 1906. A 9-mile branch line which climbed the mountains to reach Andes opened in 1907. In the Kingston Daily Freeman in 1939, a reporter wrote, "Few mountain routes could be more picturesque. It runs almost water level westerly from Arkville, through narrow gorges, wide valleys, over a variety of farmlands, and some of the station stops are mere hamlets hard to find on a map. It has been a serviceable economic factor in the life of the people of the area, and many will miss its dinky trains if the day comes when they run no more." That day, in fact, came in 1942 when the railroad was abandoned, its right-of-way sacrificed for the 19-mile-long Pepacton Reservoir, and its scrap metal was used to support the war effort during World War II. So, personally speaking, with a lifelong interest in railroads and a great deal of my youth spent in the Catskill Mountains, the D&N story captured my attention. One of my earliest exposures to the railroad was reading an article from the September 1943 issue of Railroad magazine. Titled "Rails Rust in the Catskills," author H. Gross tells the railroad's tale through the recollections of 4 of its former employees: Jim Welch, superintendent until the end; Harry J. Miller, former general freight and passenger agent; Harry G. Eckert, chief clerk and dispatcher; and Ira E. Terry, former Andy station agent and later clerk, assistant dispatcher, and assistant to the VP, gathered in Margaretville after the railroad shut down to regale Gross with the story of their railroad, the Delaware Northern. The article provides a pretty good sense of the railroad, both its history, problems, quirks, and character. So I've made this article the basis of the first part of tonight's presentation, taking what Welch, Miller, Eckert, and Terry shared and pairing it with some additional information I was able to glean through research to provide the history of the D&N. The second part of my presentation will be a tour of the railroad's route and the towns it served. So here we go, Delaware Northern, rails rust in the Catskills. And this first shot was taken at Margaretville. That station sign actually was part of the Walter Rich estate and got auctioned off about a dozen years ago now. So it still exists somewhere out there. So Gross's story began. She was always going to be a great road someday, pronounced Harry Miller, one-time general freight and passenger agent on the now abandoned Delaware Northern. James Welch, also called Jim Welch, dispatcher in 1906 when engine number 1 first arrived in Downsville, New York, and superintendent of the line from 1911 to the hour in October 1942, when the last train puffed over the winding rails between East Branch and Arkville, New York, shook his head. We never had enough working capital. Harry Eckert, brass pounder and dispatcher through the 36 years the road operated, joined in the talk. We worked like devils, fought them all, the O&W, the D&H, even the New York Central. Not a man on the road didn't do 10 jobs, let alone his own. Snow slides when our engine was buried so deep we siphoned snow into the tank to keep up steam so as not to freeze to death before we could dig out. 36 hours of that one time. Floods, washouts, receiverships, we went through them all. And still the big time was coming, we thought. We had our fun, said Ira Terry, who later got hired on with the Ontario and Western. It was a great game. Harry Eckert summed it up. A great dream. The dream first took shape in the mind of Russell B. Williams, also more commonly referred to as R.B. Williams, who was superintendent of the Scranton division of the O&W. Williams, a native of Xenia, Ohio, had first gone into tile manufacturing before getting a job with the small Ohio Railroad in 1883. From there, he worked for several railroads before landing a job as superintendent of construction of the West Shore Railroad between Kingston and Schenectady, where he had a charge of over 10,000 men. Then, in 1891, he took a job at the O&W as superintendent of their Scranton division, which was the major coal feeder of the O&W Railroad. Williams was also an intimate friend of United States President William McKinley, a fellow native Ohioan who was sadly assassinated in his second term in office in 1901, which led to the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. McKinley was a frequent visitor to the Williams home in Ohio. Williams was also a very close friend of Joseph J. German. The Germans were a well-known and wealthy family in Scranton. John J. German, Joseph's father, had built himself a coal mining empire worth millions. The elder German bought, developed, operated, and sold many coal mines throughout Pennsylvania. German also owned large swaths of real estate and even dabbled in banking. The town of German, Pennsylvania was named in John Jay's honor. The younger German had been associated with his father since his youth, accompanying him to the mines when he was just 12 years old. After his father's death in 1902, the younger German took over many of his family's enterprises. He was recognized as a man of great energy and public spirit and was viewed by many as one of the strong men of Scranton. At that time, hauling anthracite coal from the mines in and around Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, was a big business. Rail lines stretch out in all directions like spokes from a hub. One of the big markets were Schenectady and Albany to the northeast, and the New England markets beyond. The Delaware and Hudson held a virtual monopoly on the anthracite business from northeast Pennsylvania to New England. So R.B. Williams envisioned a railroad line that was to directly compete with the D&H. So here's the D&H. It would run between the D&H and Lackawanna from Wilkes-Barre northeastward towards Scranton, cross the O&W at Hancock, wind its way through the East Branch Valley to Arkville, where it would meet with the Ulster and Delaware. Then it would enter the valley of the Schoharie Creek at Prattsville, cross the D&H at Delanson, then run parallel with it to Schenectady, where it would connect with the Boston and Maine, and thereby connect with the New England markets. Williams's road would open up the somewhat isolated East Branch Valley. Freight rates on the big roads were high, too high for the valley farmers, and Williams's road would mean coal pouring into the East Branch Valley, with lumber, bluestone, and dairy products flowing back out. The dairy industry was a big business then in Delaware County, and enthusiasm spread from Williams and German to a man named Frederick F. Searing of Paterson, New Jersey, attorney and financier who coincidentally vacationed in Andes, New York, which is located up the Tremperskill Valley from the East Branch. Frederick Frelinghuysen Searing, commonly referred to as F.F. Searing in paperwork, promoted the capital that built as much of the DNN that ever materialized. He was a motivated yet somewhat mediocre businessman. All of his professional accomplishments were predicated upon the great fortune of his familial relations. So let's dig into those. A native of Dover, New Jersey, Searing was the son of Isaac Webb Searing, a well-respected and member of the Dover community, head of the Dover Lumber Company, a promoter of the Dover Free Public Library, and a successful local banker and financier. Although the younger Searing rode his father's coattails into the banking profession, his most consequential professional decision was probably the selection of a wife. Searing married Emma Cook of Patterson's illustrious Cook family. Her father, Watts Cook Jr., had learned locomotive building from Thomas Rogers at the Rogers Locomotive Works. He later relocated to Scranton, where the Lackawanna Railroad made him superintendent of rolling stock in 1854 and later superintendent of their entire system in 1864. In 1868, Cook returned to Patterson, where he started the Passaic Rolling Mill and the Patterson National Bank. Searing began working at that bank in 1890 and married into the Cook family only a year later. Watts's brother, John Cook, was also trained in the locomotive building profession by Thomas Rogers and founded the Cook Locomotive Works of Patterson in 1852, which later merged along with the Rogers Locomotive Works into the American Locomotive Company, ALCO, in about 1900. Searing partnered with his brother-in-law, Albert Cecil Fairchild, to start their very first banking institution. After that, they partnered with Walter Cook to take over the Passaic Rolling Mill, which had been founded by Watts Cook. Then, along with a business associate of Searing's father, Harry M. George, and support from Searing's father, Searing and Fairchild started their own private banking house in 1903 called Searing and Company. The German and Cook families, Joseph J. German of Scranton, knew each other intimately from Watts Cook's time in Scranton. From this connection, German knew of Searing's successes and believed him to be a competent financier of Williams's proposed railroad to link Wilkes-Barre with the New England markets. So Searing, Williams, and German also had numerous connections to the former members of President William McKinley's administration. They employed every prominent connection at their disposal to generate capital and standing for the railroad project. There was former New Jersey Governor John Griggs, who had served as President McKinley's Attorney General and had worked alongside Watts Cook as a Martin Act commissioner. Colonel William Barbour, who ran in Patterson circles and was a close associate of Governor Griggs. There also came a lot of support from the Pittsburgh banking and steel interests. The Title Guarantee and Trust Company of Pittsburgh became one of the project's chief promoters. Title Guarantee's president and former Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor Lewis A. Waters was chief among them. There were also many other connections that became associated with the railroad project. Searing's business partners, Fairchild and Harry George, colleagues of Searing's father, and other captains of politics and industry. There were many, many connections between the syndicate that became known as the Searings-Williams Syndicate and the former William McKinley administration, and also connections with former Vice President Garrett Hobart, who was William McKinley's first vice president, who was from New Jersey, who unfortunately died in 1899, which is why Theodore Roosevelt was put on the ticket in 1900. So the men who kind of rallied around Searings, William, and German were all captains of industry, were all well-known men, a lot of veterans of the Civil War, presidential connections. So there was a lot of horsepower behind this project. So the Searings-Williams Syndicate, as it was called, incorporated the Delaware and Eastern Railroad Company on November 14th, 1904 to fulfill Williams's vision. However, they only publicly announced that a line would be constructed between Arkville, New York and East Branch, New York. So contracts were let, and R.B. Williams, who left his post at the O&W to become the D&E general manager, drove the first spike at Arkville, New York on September 14th, 1905. And there is R.B. Williams right there in his characteristic wide brim hat, driving the first spike at Arkville. So the maps were completed and work began on the road. Work was hustled to get Margaretville connected in time for the county fair. The capital of the newly chartered road was in excess of $1 million, but Searing and Williams spent like the rail magnates that they hoped to become. Creameries and depots sprang up at Arena, Shavertown, Pepacton, Downsville, and Margaretville. The railroad actually constructed its own creameries to serve the area. Between 200 and 300 men, many of them Italians from Pittsburgh and Chicago, were working on the Andes branch alone, the 9 miles between Shavertown and Andes. The lieutenant governor, M.L. Bruce, had a summer home at Andes, where it was expected vacationists would flock as soon as the first train rumbled over the new rails. On completion of the road between East Branch and Arkville, the rolling stock consisted of 2 passenger engines, the Searings and the Williams, both bought in 1905, 3 freight locomotives, the Fairchild, the George, and the Murray, all named in honor of the railroad's members of the railroad's board of directors, 2 coaches, several boxcars and flat cars, one of which sported a hand derrick and a single caboose. The passenger locomotives, both 440 American types, were numbered numbers 1 and 2, when the Fairchild became the 3-spot. Engines George and Murray, also 440s, took their place in line as numbers 4 and 5. All of the locomotives were originally owned by the Lackawanna Railroad, and one of them, in fact, was built by the Cook Locomotive Works, built by Searing's in-laws. We thought we were off to a flying start, Jim Welch recalled. 5 locomotives plus other equipment, the new locomotive and repair shops here at Margaretville, 45 miles of track from East Branch to Arkville, assorted creameries and depots along the line. We got ready to celebrate. A special car from New York brought President Searing, the officers and directors up to Downsville on November 17th. Downsville sits snugly in a Swiss-like valley, surrounded by towering mountains and bumper crop farms where fine horses and herds of dairy cattle graze. Searing's car halted at the depot, 125 feet below the creamery. A shouting crowd, distinguished, Ira Terry recalls, a local newspaper reporting, by the Niagara-like beards of the men and the furred hoods of the women, swarmed the 8-foot platform all around the station house. The band paraded while R.B. Williams, who had driven the first spike at Arkville back in September 1905, drove the last spike of the completed road. Nobody thought it was the last, Harry Miller said. So here's the throngs of people at the Eagle Hotel in Downsville on November 17th, 1906. Plans, grandiose promises for the future, filled the frosty air as thick as hard coal smoke. After the exhibition of typical vehicles, past and present, President Searing stepped forward at the end of the observation car. When I first came to this valley, he orated, people lugged merchandise from Walton, 12 and 14 miles over the mountains at an elevation of 3,000 feet. I saw quarry stone carted by wagon from Shinhopple to East Branch. Now I see new buildings everywhere, banks opened, stone quarries, busy mills erected, timber tracks felled, lively bidding over property near Schenectady where the lines of the D&H and the Schenectady and Margaretville Road extension will in the future run parallel. There's President Searing at the and in the vestibule of a special car addressing the crowd at Downsville upon the opening of the main line of the D&E. And the days that followed seemed like it to the young fellows who had pinned their dreams to the success of the road. Every day was an excursion day. Barrels and oil rounds were set up inside box and flat cars, planks laid across them, and men and women who had never seen a train before rode with cinders down their backs and hands batting at singed hair. Harry Eckert remembered one such trip with 8 flat cars stretched out behind the 2 old coaches. Here's locomotive number 1, the FF Searing. The year 1906 saw 144,000 such passengers make the trip from East Branch to Arkville and back. Freight traffic was heavy too. The stone factory at Arena shipped 4 cars of stone per week. Lumber and dairy products went out by tons. The cauliflower industry, which had its earliest beginnings in the valley when Harry Bench Schoten, a Dutch farmer, planted a few rows of the strange seed from the old countries, zoomed with 3 carloads per day during the growing season, moving towards city markets. At the time when the main line opened at Downsville on November 17th, 1906, Frederick F. Searing let the cat out of the bag that the D&E was going to extend its road to Wilkes-Barre to the southwest and Schenectady to the northeast. The D&H, which would run parallel to the D&E, soon moved against the new railroad. The D&H took control of the little 4-mile Schoharie Valley Railroad, which ran between Schoharie and Schoharie Junction, where it connected with the D&H. A line that the D&E hoped to incorporate as part of its route. And along with the Ulster and Delaware and O&W, the D&H challenged the D&E's petition to extend its line. The fight was on. Newspapers in the little towns through the valley shouted in the headlines, "Go to Albany for the hearing. Send a rousing delegation, 25 strong." "We were there all right," Jim Welch remembered with a chuckle. The D&H's attorney asked if a line built by the D&H between Middleburg and Grand Gorge wouldn't serve the same purpose as the proposed road. "Right," Harry Eckert joined in again. Then Searing's attorney charged the D&H with excessive rates. Why coal was $11 a ton, passenger rates 5 cents a mile or more. A big crowd of valley men had ganged in the hall. They began shouting at the commissioners, telling him the D&H never carried any coal except what was produced in its own mines. He laughed. They yelled and stamped on the floor too. When it came to the question of grades, ours was less than the D&H's, and our route between Wilkes-Barre and Schenectady would be shorter. The 3 railroads, the D&H, the UND, and the O&W, combined in a joint suit against the Railroad Commission to cancel the permits. This dragged on through 1908 and was finally lost by the D&H when the state Supreme Court ruled against the petitioners. Meanwhile, work continued. The mere trestle on the Andes branch, pictured here, 500 feet long, 45 feet high, and containing 195,000 feet of lumber, was completed. The Andes branch itself, which climbed the Tremperskill Valley and measured 9 miles long, opened on March 23rd, 1907. Contracts were let on the Schenectady and Margaretville extension, which would stretch from Grand Gorge, New York, all the way to Schenectady. At Prattsville, work on the line to Schenectady rushed and slowed and rushed again. Founded by Zadok Pratt of tannery fame, Prattsville stood 600 feet below towering cliffs, the Schoharie Creek running northward through its fertile flats to lose itself in a bend of the Catskills. Railroad stakes went up to the north, amid the roar from the Devasego Falls, pictured here, and the Manorkills Falls. The road was to cross the stream over a 150-foot trestle. Looking up 100 feet, passengers would see water tumbling over the brink above, while 150 feet below, the base of the falls foamed white. The Devasego Falls, pictured here, are now located beneath the waters of the Schoharie Reservoir. Meanwhile, trouble brewed. Searing and Williams were at loggerheads. A telegram addressed to Williams and received at Andes in 1907 reads, "You fellows make me sick. No teamwork here. F.F. Searing." The story, Jim Welch explained, was not, as Searing intimated, was not one of negligence on the part of Williams and the local officials, but one of unpaid crews and consequent delays on all sides. Searing and Company were having trouble continuing to fund construction and raise capital. By February 1908, Williams asked for and received a leave of absence. The man who had planned the road and was responsible for most of its success so far never returned to the struggling D&E until Searing was definitely out of it. Shortly after his return, he died. That was a winter, Superintendent Welch reminisced. Four judgments against us, aggregating $118,000. Unpaid contractors howling bloody murder, and the D&H chose at this time to bring another motion to overturn the action of the old State Board of Railroad Commissioners in granting our original charter. Workmen struck. Supply houses refused credit on necessary tools and material. The road was behind in payment of taxes. The towns between East Branch and Margaretville were lenient, but Hancock, whose main hamlet was a little beyond the western terminus of the road as it had been built, and therefore less credulous regarding its future, displayed considerable impatience at its failure to collect a $700 tax levy. The Hancock constable presented himself at East Branch, the O&W depot pictured here, in the dead of night, where he mounted locomotive number 1, the FF Searing, with a gun. The next morning, when engineer Claire Cowan appeared, he was forbidden to enter. The freight crew, with Sam Fullerton as conductor, awaited orders from the local office. They were told to withdraw and left the engine in charge of the constable. They did so, and the delayed freight left East Branch a little later behind number 2, which had been rushed over from Margaretville. The day passed and the night, with the constable keeping the fire burning and the steam up for his own sake. At noon on Sunday, Superintendent Wagonhorse, with a 5-man crew, rushed down the track in number 3. Threw out a 3-link. Threw out a 3-link, hitched it around the drawhead, and pulled. The constable threw the reverse lever in the one spot. A tug of war ensued. The driving wheels slipped. Sparks flew. The engines puffed and sputtered, and the men cursed. The slipping grew dangerous. Both crews then got out, put little pebbles on the rails to aid in giving traction, and returned to their respective engines. Number 3 backed up to number 1, and going the full length of the chain, tried to pull the arrested engine her way. The chain broke, and the constable took back to his cab in his locomotive back to the starting point. Tug of war began again. One of the 3 spots crew, under the cover of escaping steam, crept around and loosened the relief valve of number 1's cylinder, leaving her powerless. Old number 3 put on full speed for Margaretville. Luckily, the constable's force jumped from number 1, enabling the lead engine to settle down to a less dangerous pace. That night, a special train to East Branch took all of the D&E freight from the depot there. Saturday was the last day the Hancock tax warrant was in force, and therefore another levy could not be made on Monday. Papers were made out for the arrest of the Hancock constable, charging him with the assault with a deadly weapon. The Hancock chief of police retorted by arresting Wagonhorse on a charge of riot. Both proceedings were quietly dropped, but Harry Eckert remembers seeing Superintendent Wagonhorse sneak in over the covered bridge at Margaretville, head turned to look behind him. There's number 3, the rescue engine. And here's a drawing of the tug of war that ensued. Here we are at East Branch, where the whole debacle took place. Meanwhile, things took an upgrade in September of 1909. Contracts were approved and were let for construction at Grand Gorge. Carloads of material arrived on the Ulster and Delaware Railroad at the contemplated connection. Boom days again. Camps for workmen lined the right-of-way between Grand Gorge and all the way up the Schoharie Valley. Final surveys rushed to keep out of the way of incoming carloads of men, powder, dynamite, steam shovels, dinky engines, dump cars, and rails. Men and materials poured into Grand Gorge, an inferno of congestion as Gandy dancers strove frantically day and night to build sidetracks and storehouses. This time, they thought the line was coming through. But ruin for Searing and Company was just in the offing. An attachment brought by bond salesman F.P. Tagliena on a claim of $85,000 arising out of commissions on $3.5 million worth of bonds Searing had employed him to sell in London, England, brought the end. More simply put, Searing and Company just could not raise any more capital to construct the railroad. Before January 1910, the road was in receivership, with Andrew Moreland and Walter A. Trowbridge as receivers. The rest of that winter, the line struggled with flood, unprecedented snowfall, striking labor, more judgments, actions, and restraining orders. But hope rose again in 1911 when the road was reorganized by a bondholders committee led by William H. Seif as the Delaware and Northern Railroad. The general offices were moved to Margaretville, with Jim Welch appointed as superintendent in full charge of the organization of all departments. Two of the railroad's original engines, numbers 3 and 5, were scrapped. Actually, I found a news article that says that they were dynamited at Margaretville, which is quite interesting. And new ones, all 440s, formerly with the Southern Indiana Railway, were purchased from American Equipment Company and reconditioned by the Baldwin Locomotive Works, the first of which is pictured here. Numbers 1, 2, and 4 from the D&E were retained and renumbered numbers 5, 4, and 6, respectively. An 8-wheel caboose was also added to the list of equipment at this time. Years later, in 1923 and 1929, respectively, the railroad acquired number 7, a 10-wheeler, and number 10, a mogul from the Emporia Manufacturing Company. But for the present, things were looking up mightily. Between 1913 and 1917, a yearly average of 500 carloads of merchandise were unloaded in the valley. The Margaretville shop force reached an all-time high of 20 men. Coincidentally, a distant cousin of mine was also employed in the Margaretville shops, a man by the name of Conrad Bloom, a first cousin way back down the line. A new coach was purchased. 2 additional motor cars were purchased and additional equipment. Between 7 and 10 men were employed in the office. Margaretville's annual county fair, complete with such attractions as a hot air balloon, ascension, horse racing, cattle, and canning exhibitions, brought thousands of passengers in from surrounding villages and towns. Yet, in 1916, the line was forced to declare a deficit of $26,000. Since 1907, New York City surveyors had swung chains through the valley in search of a proper site for a new water reservoir. The failing DNN saw in this a hope for the future. DNN officials met with representatives from the various towns to discuss an extension from Andes to Bovina. Officials also sought to build a branch line from Grand Gorge to Prattsville to haul the immense supplies that would be needed for the city's Gilboa Dam. The railroad still at that point owned a right-of-way from the failed Schenectady and Margaretville extension. But by 1915, the town of Bovina still refused the necessary guarantee, and the plan had to be dropped. The short branch line from Grand Gorge to Prattsville never materialized. The reported profit loss due to operating under federal control from 1918 to 1920 was almost $51,000. So with a huge deficit staring them in the face, DNN officials petitioned the Public Service Commission for permission to increase its passenger rate from 3.6 cents a mile to 5 cents. Villages along the line rallied to support the struggling railroad by reducing its taxes to $100 per mile. But the incredulous citizens of Hancock, actually the generous citizens of Hancock collected among themselves the $1,500, which their town could not seem to afford to rescind, and paid it to Hancock in the railroad's name. Ira Terry later recalled, people in the valley loved the DNN. But love couldn't stave off the effects of the post-war depression, automobile and truck competition, plus the chronic lack of working capital. Just switch to The railroad slipped into its second receivership on March 16th, 1921, against a motion to discontinue the railroad brought by the railroad's creditors, among them the original promoter, Joseph J. German, the Title Guarantee and Trust Company. The new receivers, Andrew Moreland and Jim Welch, proposed a $12,000 a yearly reduction of expenses, accompanied by a guarantee of operation for 10 years to come. Employees accepted individual wage cuts to the required total, but then at the last minute, federal judge Cooper ordered wages reduced by 20%. A general walkout of the employees followed and continued during 2 days of unrest and dissension. On the third day, businessmen along the railroad pledged themselves to make good on the employees' wages until August 1st, when the receiver's certificates had to be financed. Jim Welch continued in his reminiscing of the railroad. We shut off the Andes branch immediately. Other curtailments and economies, such as the purchase of a new gasoline combination passenger, mail, and express car, kept the line going. Harry Miller laughed. We sure thought that combination car was something. She took the place of a passenger train, made 2 round trips daily. I remember she had a 15-foot space for the railway post office, 15 feet for the baggage express, and a passenger compartment with room for 30 passengers. The power plant was a 250 horsepower gasoline engine directly connected, like an automobile, to the wheels. And here she is pictured at Arkville. Harry Eckert, who took her alone to East Branch and back a number of times, put in. She had a 6-inch bore and a 7-inch stroke, 5 speeds in forward and in reverse. J.G. Brill of Philadelphia made her. The old girl saved us around $30,000 a year, Superintendent Welch finished. We bought her in 1926. Too late for her to show up in single track, Miller grinned, referring to the Corinne Griffith movie filmed by Vitagraph on the D&N tracks in 1920. Remember how the public service safety inspector ragged us about the mirror trestle on the Andes branch? Ira Terry asked. Well, Vitagraph wanted that trestle to look new for one of its shots. I don't recall exactly. Somebody was to jump off the trestle, commit suicide there. Anyway, they sprayed the whole blam thing with water clay paint. Clay colored. 2 years later, the inspector looked at that bridge, jumped to the conclusion that it was actually brand new, and gave us credit for having put up another trestle. Well, we didn't open our mouths, he said. Harry Eckert was laughing again. Remember those dummies they used for the trestle jump? About 4 in all, I guess. They stored them in a tool house over at Andes, went off and forgot about them. Everybody else forgot about them too. Then Miller here sent one of the trackmen, an Italian, plenty superstitious, over for something one day. The scream that fellow let out when he pushed open that door and those dummies fell over him, he thought they were all dead men, and so did all of Andes, till some old timer remembered and got up the nerve to investigate those murdered corpses. The 4 men all laughed together. Well, one of them said, those were the days. Miss Griffith used to corral the roundhouse gang, take 'em all fishing. Used to wait out in hip boots and an old conductor's hat she'd picked up. She pointed up the track to the spot where the Binnykill divides from the Delaware, by the width of the 3-foot island. Yep, just about there she used to stand, facing Binnykill, the depot behind her. The D&N had its triumphs, all right. In September 1928, though, the Pittsburgh and Shummet Coal Company, the Title Guarantee and Trust Company, and Joseph J. German, the railroad's 3 largest creditors, filed a petition in federal court to discontinue operations of the railroad. We are at the end of every chance, Jim Welch recalled. Buses, trucks, cars, the whole new setup of the late 1920s and the early 30s ruined us. Increased use of cement, stopped paving and flagstone shipments, and the mountainsides were stripped of timber. No lumber was going out. Even the chemical plants closed because the wood supply was exhausted. There wasn't enough traffic to pay for running one train per day. The 3 months that followed that petition, well, we had to sit here and see the line rusting out clean out from under us. Then Sam Rossoff got interested. Harry Eckert took up the story. Subway Sam, born in Minsk, Russia, now part of Belarus, left it in steerage, began life in New York as a newsboy, and now was just back from building the great Moscow subway system. He knew our history. He'd built the state-improved highway through here 10 years before. The most generous man I ever saw. In a way, he was another D&N triumph. He bought us on December 20th, complete with all 60 pieces of rolling stock, the depots, right of way, track, and took us over on the 27th. That was 1928. Things began to hum. The Downsville News announced the sale with a remark that Rossoff had undoubtedly acquired the railroad not so much for speculative purposes. There was talk that he intended a multi-million-dollar squeeze play on the city of New York, as to have the same as his own in hauling material for construction work on the dam that was proposed to be built by the New York City Board of Water Supply, and concluded with a careful aside to the effect that Rossoff undoubtedly had the contract for the building of the dam in his pocket before he invested in half-defunct Delaware Northern. Much speculation as to the price paid for the road was voiced in all quarters. The Walton Reporter newspaper repeated the often suggested sum of $750,000 paid for the railroad. Actually, Jim Welch remarked, the price was $70,000. The bigger amount showed the speculative value ownership of the railroad appeared to have. It did look as if Rossoff was gambling on a sure thing. The reservoir was slated, the dam had to come. A man who owned the railroad could underbid every other contractor. Nobody could guess that war was coming, with a shortage of supplies and materials, and practically complete stoppage of all such projects. New York Times gave Rossoff's price as 10 cents on the dollar. The fact that he was the sole owner, the article continued in a tone of enmity, obviated the approval of the Public Service Commission. 2 days later, the New York World newspaper intimated that an investigation was due. Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, who later became the president in 1933, should inquire minutely into the question whether the state's interest in the development of the Delaware water resources would be jeopardized in any way by Rossoff's purchase of this little railroad. Up here, Eckert explained, we didn't know what was happening. Why, we were getting ready to extend the line. We were going to finish up that old Schenectady-Margaretville route up in style, go down to Wilkes-Barre, bring out the anthracite, and follow up straight to Schenectady. The old dream, it was coming true at last, and here we were, fellows who had stuck with the railroad through thick and thin, through everything. We believed it. We thought it could happen. Then suavely, a New York paper reported that the Interstate Commerce Commission is against the policy of granting extensions that will increase competition among the railroads, with the pointed addition to the effect that there are few places in Pennsylvania where the Delaware Northern might extend without touching other railroads. Before the Public Service Commission, which heard Sam Rossoff without opposition from the city of New York, Rossoff announced his willingness to raise the Delaware Northern to a point higher along the mountain if and when the city should require the entire right-of-way, or the estimated 2/3 of it for the site of the city's reservoir. He added that he was willing to sell the railroad at the city's own price. Federal Judge Cooper approved Rossoff's purchase of the railroad on January 11th, 1929. Rossoff and the officers and men whose lives centered in and around the Margaretville shops and offices went ahead with negotiations for new rolling stock. The depots along the road were remodeled and repainted. The light 65-pound rail was replaced with 85-pound steel. Rossoff told the New York Times on March 9th that he expected the renovated line to earn $250,000 within the next 9 months, hauling freight to the dam site near Shavertown. One of the highlights of those days was the installation of a special train by Rossoff for the school children of the valley. If I can help these children get an education, I'll do it even if I have to carry them for nothing, the former newsboy said. Then, like a bolt from the blue, came the announcement that New York City had moved to block the reorganization plans. The Public Service Commission denied the DNN a permit on the same day that 18 carloads of new 85-pound rails arrived in Andes, Middletown, and Colchester. The little railroad seemed about to collapse again. Not until December of 1929 was the reorganization finally approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission. By that time, though, the Great Depression had arrived. The freight cars behind old number 10 swayed empty around Catskill curves. We were in the limelight in those years too, Superintendent Welch commented. New York newspapers featured us every time Rossoff's new motor bus left the track. We never had even the average number of wrecks, but they made it seem like we couldn't make a run without a collision or an accident. The motor bus hit a New York Central locomotive in a head-on collision at Arkville. Damages around $8,000. In 1939, the gasoline bus left the rails above Arena, pictured here. They played that up big, carried pictures of the wreck. Crash injures children. About 10 of the passengers were slightly hurt, but the newspapers were gunning for Rossoff. He looked too big to a lot of people. We sort of rode along in those years, Eckert continued the story. Used to halt the train whenever we took the notion. Trainmen liked to chat along the way. He remembered once, just below Downsville, number 3 was to switch below the creamery. Number 3 at the creamery, pictured here. Part of us switched her. The rest of us got off to pull a farmer's truck out of the mud. That was D&N service. Used to stop anywhere between the points if we had something to deliver. Didn't matter. One package was enough. Most of the young fellows were on their way out. I got out, Ira Terry explained. All the younger men did. Hated to, but we had to live. The gasoline car was the only thing that kept the railroad going in those last years. Sure, Miller nodded. I went into insurance myself. Couldn't somehow change over from the DNN. The payroll had jumped from 325 men, around $45,000 a month, to next to nothing. Towns around here began to look like ghost towns. That is, as far as a railroader was concerned. No use in hanging on, though you wanted to, he admitted. In August 1942, Subway Sam Rossoff sold the Delaware Northern to the city of New York for an even $200,000. In the 13 years that he had owned it, he had sunk $60,000 a year in the line from the date he bought it to the date he sold. Traffic had dwindled to almost nothing. The right-of-way was needed for the reservoir site, and it was impractical to raise the tracks higher on the mountainsides as he had planned earlier. And that was really the end, Eckert recalled. Negotiations had dragged on. Sometimes it seemed like they had dragged on forever. You'd got sick of it by that time. Then, on October 16th, 1942, they tacked the notice of abandonment on the depot doors from Arkville to East Branch. That was it. Done. And here is the rail bus on the last trip at East Branch in 1942. Actually, on the last run, there were still a car at the feed store in Margaretville, and they brought out the rail bus the next day. And in true DNN fashion, when they was grabbing the boxcar to take up to Arkville, the rail bus ran out of gas. To wrap up the story of the history, the four old timers, Welch, Eckert, Miller, and Terry, turned from the deserted sidings, the rotted old coaches, and the flat cars, and the closed depot where the first steam shovel was sunk in 1904. Harry Miller laughed suddenly. We went out in a blaze of glory, sort of, he explained. Got mixed up with the FBI, no less. A couple of kids around 17 years old heaved a pile of ties on the tracks at the bridge across the Tremperskill one Friday night in April. Just happened we didn't run a train until Monday, one of our off weeks. He grinned. Section foreman found the ties Sunday morning. Someone got excited and reported the whole business to the U.S. Commissioner at Binghamton. Well, they put those kids under $1,000 bond each and announced that the Delaware Northern was used considerably for the shipment of materials to defense plants. Miller cocked his head at Jim Welch. Know what those shipments were, Super? Welch grinned back at him. Must have been that bluestone that went down to Washington to build one of those new government buildings. The men closed out their story. The valley is still prosperous, they explained. Farm produce, bluestone, some lumber grow out by trucks to meet the New York by truck to meet the New York Central at Arkville, and vacationists come in via the O&W at Kingston. Harry Eckert looked back. 40,000 tons of scrap metal, he said. Old coaches, locomotives, everything worth $50,000. They say she'll make 400 medium-sized tanks for the war effort. He was looking at the end of the railroad, at the end of a dream. He glanced up. Around the curve, below the old switch, came the D&N handcar. She was stepping along like a Red Ball freight when we first caught sight of her. The engineer, somewhat bigger than the four little shavers who sat atop, stumbled over a rotted tie. The car lurched, righted herself, and went careening past us into the Margaretville station. Harry Eckert caught his breath, laughed. That's it, brother. A swell little pike, and still a going concern, by dad. And here's the D&N handcar at Dunraven. Said it could outwhistle the O&W's Mountaineer. So, to wind up the story of the history of the D&N, with the wartime labor shortages, it took more than a year to pull up the rails. A Hyman Michaels company of Chicago came and did that work, which was completed by May 1944. Any property that wasn't sold to New York City for the reservoir was auctioned off, including the buildings, including those here at Margaretville. World War II delayed the start of the construction of the Downsville Dam and the Pepacton Reservoir. Construction of the dam and the reservoir displaced nearly 1,000 valley residents and led to the destruction of the hamlets of Arena, Pepacton, Shavertown, and Union Grove. The dam's construction was completed in 1954, and flooding of the reservoir was completed in 1955. About 19 miles of the D&N right-of-way was submerged. Today, time has reclaimed much of the D&N right-of-way that remained outside the reservoir, but station buildings still remain at Andes, Downsville, and Harvard. The stations at Downsville and Harvard are privately owned, but the building up at Andes, which last saw a train about 100 years ago this month, actually exactly 100 years ago this month, still exists and was renovated by the town of Andes as a museum, I believe. And there's also a short rail trail on the Andes branch. Today, it's a long and lonesome ride along the many curves of Route 30 between on the rerouted Route 30 between Margaretville and Downsville, along the banks of the Pepacton Reservoir. But the story of this little mountain short line remains. So with that, let's take a tour of the D&N. So the D&N main line followed the East Branch Valley for 37.5 miles between Arkville and East Branch. As it followed the valley, it did not encounter much in the way of significant grade since it followed the valley floor. But it did have many curves and several significant bridges. The main line passed through the hamlets, communities, and sometimes just wide spots in the road Margaretville, Keeney's, Dunraven, Arena, Union Grove, Shavertown, Pepacton, Downsville, Colchester, Corbett, Gregorytown, Shinhopple, Long Flat, and Harvard. Connection was made with the Catskill Mountain branch of the New York Central. Earlier, the Ulster and Delaware Railroad at Arkville, and the Ontario and Western Railway at East Branch. A 9-mile branch line extended up the Tremperskill through Pleasant Valley, Wolf Hollow, and Kaufman's to the village of Andes. All these places were located within the towns of Middletown, Andes, Colchester, and Hancock. During the years that the DNN operated, no more than 14,000 people ever lived in these towns in any year. Even today, this area is sparsely settled, but still remains some of the most beautiful countryside in the Northeast. So there's the New York Central, the Catskill Mountain Branch, earlier the Ulster and Delaware, and then the O and W connection at East Branch. So the DNN started at a connection in Arkville. So here is the Ulster and Delaware Railroad, later the Catskill Mountain Branch. So the Ulster and Delaware, over its 107-mile main line, went through several river valleys. So here it came down the Dry Brook Valley, down off of Pine Hill, curved, and then started heading upstream up the East Branch Valley, up towards Roxbury. So here at Arkville is where the DNN connected with the New York Central. Interchange was made with the New York Central within its small yard in Arkville, which is now the yard of the Delaware and Ulster Railroad, which is a tourist line operation on a isolated segment of the old UND. There was also a turntable passenger station and freight house located within the yard. The DNN actually had its own freight house right on Route 28 in Arkville. Arkville itself was named in reference to the biblical Noah's Ark. The Rondout and Oswego Railroad, later known as the UND, later the New York Central, operated its first train through Arkville on October 24th, 1871. The railroad station there was called Dean's Corner for a time. Arkville was at the bottom of the west end of the Pine Hill grade, which was the steepest grade on the UND. I believe it was in excess of 3.5% on either side of the grade, the summit of which was at Grand Hotel at the bottom of Bellaire Mountain. The New York Central and earlier the UND stationed helpers locomotives at Arkville to push trains up and over the hill. The DNN and the UND, or the Central, diverged just west of the Route 28 crossing. The Central curved northwards towards Roxbury, while the DNN curved westwards towards Margaretville and crossed the Dry Brook right here, just west of town. So here's a bird's eye view of Arkville. As we go through the tour, I have this map on the right side of the slide here with an arrow kind of showing our location. So here's a map that appeared in Harry Archer's book, The Damn Nuisance, which is a history of the DNN. So here's the turntable, here's the DNN interchange track, the station, and the freight house. The station is long gone, but the freight house still exists, which is used by the Delaware and Ulster as their train station today. The DNN and the UND actually had separate tracks here, so there's one little inaccuracy on this map. There's two tracks that crossed Route 28 here. So here's a shot of a UND train at Arkville. Here's the order board. The UND was actually a really busy railroad, especially during the summer vacation season. Actually, further east of this part of the railroad, between Phoenicia and Kingston, was actually governed by automatic block signal, which just kind of speaks to the busyness of the railroad. So, and Arkville was a pretty hopping place as far as railroads activity was concerned, with the helper station here, regular scheduled UND freight service, passenger service, and then the DNN making the connection. So here's the Arkville train station, and then up here would be Route 28 today. Here's a shot of DNN number 10 making the interchange Arkville in 1938. So in 1936, the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society, the railroad enthusiasts, and the International Engine Picture Club partnered to run an all-day excursion, which included a trip over the entire length of the main line of the Catskill mountain branch between Kingston and Oneonta. And a stop was made in Arkville. So here is the picture of that stop with all the rail fans outside the train in the Arkville yard. So the DNN, while its route was not part of the excursion, did send up its locomotive number 3 up to the Arkville yard to be put on display for the rail fans during the stop there. So there's lots and lots of shots of this number 3 parked up in the UND, the Catskill Mountain Branch yard at Arkville in 1936. So here's some more shots. This is the New York Central Archive. This is the east end of Arkville Yard, Route 28 back here. Some helper engines of the New York Central. These are earlier belonged to the Ulster and Delaware here at Arkville. Here's another shot from the New York Central Archive. This is the DNN's Brill car, which is popularly called the Red Heifer by Valley residents. Apparently, the railroaders that worked on the DNN didn't like that name. The reason it was called the Red Heifer is because it came in a dull red color, which is probably only a primer coat of paint. And it was said that its horn kind of made the mooing sound of heifers, which is how it got its name. It was also called the Cheese Box and a couple other names. I think it was also called the Go Devil. Here in this picture, it's exchanging express packages with the New York Central at Arkville. This picture kind of illustrates how small the Brill car was compared to a heavyweight passenger car. And this passenger car is the rail bus conducted all of the express, RPO, and passenger business along the entire DNN from East Branch to Arkville. So today on the Delaware and Ulster Railroad, the tourist operation, there is a rail bus that they have called the Red Heifer as an homage to this car, whose final disposition is unknown. But the car on the Delaware and Ulster today, while named the Red Heifer, is not in fact the same car. So heading out of town, this is the Route 28 grade crossing. The DNN, the rear track, and the UND, or the Catskill Mountain Branch, both crossed here. The buildings in the background are actually both still there. So here's a Google Street View. The section of this building here is believed to have been believed to have been the DNN's freight house. There was a siding that came off and up this way that came up to this location. So it's supposed that this lean-to structure here was the freight house. Unconfirmed. Just west of the Route 28 grade crossing, you can see the DNN tracks curving away towards Margaretville. Over here is the switch that led to that freight house siding. Here's a Catskill Mountain Branch train heading eastbound with a ton of milk cars, which just exemplifies what the majority of the business in this area was for the railroads. So heading out of town, upon leaving Arkville, the DNN crossed Dry Brook on this truss bridge. This view looks east towards Arkville. This is all gone today. The abutments are gone. The grade is pretty much gone. Here's a shot of number 3 and a short freight crossing the Dry Brook Bridge. So the distance between Arkville and Margaretville is a little more than a mile. It's not a far distance at all. Um, the confluence of the Dry Brook and the East Branch of the Delaware River kind of create this wide open valley. It's like this big bowl. Um, so in this shot, number three with Caboose, is heading up the huge Delaware Northern freight consist of one boxcar, heading towards Margaretville. It's really fairly easy to spot this location today. So here's a Google Street View of the same exact location today along Route 28. So Margaretville was one of the primary communities along the DNN. It was the site of the railroad's general offices, which were first housed in a section of the old Delaware and Eastern Creamery building, and then were moved to the second floor of the Galley Kirche Theater in the middle of town. That building is still there today. In addition to this station, Margaretville is also home to all of the railroad's engine servicing facilities. In Margaretville, the DNN served the creamery, the Margaretville Foundry Company, the Union Handle Company, the G.W. Merritt Sawmill, and the James Martin Furniture Factory. A little beyond Margaretville was a stop, just a flag stop called Keeney's, which served a local boarding house. So I have to thank one of our presenters for turning me on to the USGS historical topo viewer, which is where I was able to get all these maps. So this is a modern map of Margaretville. So Route 28 was rerouted at some point after the DNN was closed, and occupies much of the right of way today, including where the shops were and where the station was. The station itself was actually burned down to make way for the highway. So here's an overview of Margaretville, still a lively community today. I do enjoy going to the July 4th fireworks every year at Margaretville. Highly recommended. So here's Harry Archer's map of Margaretville. Margaretville, the train tracks were located across the East Branch from the actual village itself. Here's the station, the creamery, which later became the offices. Over here was a turntable and another creamery, the Dairymen's League. Down here were the shops, coaling facility, water tank, woodworking shop. Again, all of this is now pretty much Route 28. And then also this connects here, shows you at the end of the street here was Galley Kirche Theater, which on the second floor was the DNN office. So here's a shot of the Margaretville station. Was located on the opposite side of the East Branch from the village. There was a covered bridge which connected the village to the station. It's a modern bridge today. There's a traffic light just about at this location. The station as well as the creamery were located at the base of Pepacton Mountain. So I believe a lot of this was excavated to put all this here on this narrow shelf between the mountain and the river here. So here's a shot kind of late in the game for the railroad. This is the bridge that replaced the original covered bridge. About here is where that traffic light is that I mentioned, and this is all Route 28. So just west of the station was the DNN shop building, as well as a coaling tower, water tank, and other facilities. This basically existed for the entire length of the railroad, its existence, 37 years. There's actually a store building made out of one of the old boxcars that the D&E had originally purchased. Here's another shot. I believe that's number 3 down the track. Here's a shot looking the other direction. Again, this is all Route 28 now. Here's a shot of number three. One of the two engines that lasted all the way till the end of the railroad was actually used in the scrapping of the railroad. Was originally built for the Southern Indiana Railway. Was purchased by the DNN and reshopped by the Baldwin Locomotive Works. This is a DNN caboose number 31. I really don't know any story of where this came from or when it was purchased. But judging by this picture, this caboose was very well used and very beat up. The grab iron is completely bent over to one side. It's missing leaf springs out of one of the trucks. One of the windows appears to be missing. Um, Supposedly in Harry Archer's book, there's a story about parties happening in one of the cabooses. That may have been this caboose, which may explain why it looks so beat up. This is a shot of one of the coaches stored at Margaretville, kind of replaced by the Brill bus when it came in 1926. But these coaches were kept on standby when the Brill bus either went off the tracks or needed repairs. Um, so, in all of the books written about the Delaware Northern, none of them in their rosters mention anything about an 80 series passenger cars. I In John Hamm's book, he mentions that these coaches came from the Long Island Railroad. I believe that these coaches may have been purchased by Sam Rossoff after he purchased the railroad in 1929, but unconfirmed. Here's the DNN's wreck train. The DNN did experience quite a few wrecks in its history and derailments, so this would have been well used. Just a simple derrick. So leaving Margaretville and going down the track, we arrive at Keeney's. So Keeney's was less than a mile from Margaretville. Was simply just a flag stop for Mrs. Keeney's boarding house. Um, and here's a picture of Mrs. Keeney at the little passenger waiting shelter, waving a flag that was used to stop the train for boarders. So back here was actually the boarding house, which was known as the Meadowbrook Farm. There's some more shots of that. So I was actually really pleased. This is the only shot I've ever seen of the Keeney's flag stop. Um, the really large sign is really kind of cool for Mrs. Keeney's boarding house. This is actually a cabinet photo that I actually picked up on eBay a few years ago. This is the shot of Meadowbrook Farm. So heading further down the line, the next stop was Dunraven. The hamlet itself was situated up on the Plattekill, further up Route 28. It was first named Clark's Factory after a family of Clarks. The railroad built a station called Dunraven near the old stone school. The location of the station has now mostly returned to woods, but the old stone schoolhouse still remains as kind of a roadside stop on the rerouted Route 28. So this modern day map shows where the station was and the modern day Route 28. And then here's kind of the extent of the Pepacton Reservoir. So this is kind of the last location on the east end of the railroad that's still not obliterated by the Pepacton Reservoir. So this shot shows DNN train stopped at Dunraven. The old schoolhouse is here on the left. Here's a DNN train, grade crossing. Another shot of the station. So here at Dunraven, there's kind of a siding. It might have been a runaround. Um, Here was M.J. Faulkner's feed store, which provided some business to the railroad. You can also see on this flat car here a bunch of milk cans piled up, which really, you know, was kind of the bread and butter, no pun intended, of the railroad for a lot of its existence. And here's the feed store. And here's the old stone school, which is still there, kind of in the woods, behind kind of a pullout on the side of Route 28 today. Here's some parting shots of the Dunraven Depot. So the next location along the DNN was Arena. This is the first location heading from east to west that is now below the Pepacton Reservoir. Um, so Arena was situated at the mouth of Mill Brook, where it met the East Branch. Yeah, here's Mill Brook. The area was first settled in 1784, with the first store opened here in 1795. The town was first known as Lumberville, pretty much alluding to the area's industry. The post office here was opened in 1856, and the hamlet's name was changed to Arena in 1883. Heading at Arena, the DNN served two different creameries, a feed warehouse, and a couple other small industries. So here's a modern day map. Arena, it's kind of funny. The town's name is just out in the middle of the reservoir. Um, this is all gone now. Here's Mill Brook. It just dumps straight into the reservoir, and here's the Route 28, which was rerouted up on higher up on the mountainside when the reservoir was built. So here's an aerial view of Arena. Here's a shot of the Arena station, one of the original stations built by the Delaware and Eastern. Here's another shot, the one of the town's churches in the background. It's one of the town's lost to the Pepacton Reservoir. And here's a grade crossing through town on Maple Avenue. Station would have been here's the grade crossing, Crossbuck. I believe the D&E station was just off to the right here, and I'd have to double check the map. So heading down further down the valley, the next stop on the DNN would have been Jacksonburg. This was again just a little flag stop for the schoolhouse, Jacksonburg School, located here. The next stop, my mouse is not cooperating. Was just a little hamlet of Union Grove, and then beyond that, was Andes Junction, where the main line connected with the Andes branch. Also here, just west of the Union Grove station, was the Union Grove Bridge. And here's the Andes branch climbing up the Trumperskill Valley up towards Andes. And then over here is Shavertown. So again, this is all under the Pepacton Reservoir. Here's where Route 28 crosses the Pepacton Reservoir right around the middle of the reservoir. Here's where the Andes branch would have been, and here's where the Union Grove Bridge would have been. Here's a shot of the Union Grove station. Some passengers, folks posing for the camera. I believe there's just one sighting here. So here's an overview of Union Grove, just a very little hamlet, just a dozen buildings or so. Another shot of Union Grove, very small hamlet. Shot of Main Street in Union Grove. So here's the twin span truss bridge crossed over the East Branch of the Delaware at Union Grove, one of the major bridges along the DNN. So interesting story about the Union Grove Bridge. So you'll notice the abutments are these stone abutments with these concrete caps here. So what had happened is there were several attempts to build railroads through the East Branch Valley before the Delaware and Eastern actually did it. So in the 1870s, Thomas Cornell was one of the promoters of a railroad called the Delaware and Middletown Railroad. So Thomas Cornell owned a steamship company and was involved with promoting the Rondout and Oswego Railroad, which later became the Ulster and Delaware. So Thomas Cornell wanted to connect his railroad at Arkville with the county seat at Delhi, which is how the Delhi and Middletown Railroad came about. So that was around the 1870s. A lot of it was graded, and these bridge abutments were built. But then came the Panic of 1873, and the railroad project failed. But these bridge abutments remained. So about 30 years later, when the D&E railroad was built, they made use of the already graded right of way and also these abutments. So that's it's kind of a neat story about these bridge abutments. So further down the line came Shavertown, which is a decently sized community as far as this area is concerned. The population there around 1910 was 125 people. There was also a long spur here at the mouth of the Tremperskill for the Merritt's Wood Acid Factory. The DNN also served two creameries at Shavertown, the Cox Brothers Sawmill, Lake and Stone Dock, and J&J Armstrong Feed Store. And then just west of Shavertown was the Rock Eddy Bridge. So here's a modern day map. It's all under the Pepacton. So here's a map from Harry Archer's book. Here's the Union Grove Station, Union Grove Bridge, Andes Junction, Andes Branch climbing up to the Tremperskill Valley up towards Andes. Here's the long spur for the Merritt Acid Factory, across the Tremperskill, which is, I believe, is where those ties were piled up that got the FBI involved. Late in the story, here are the creameries, middle of town, feed store, and the station. So here's the Shavertown station. It's a cute little depot in the middle of town. Another shot of Shavertown station. So there was an agent posted here all the way up till the end of the railroad. There's the Brill car making a stop at the station. The station agent Volney Keeter chatting with the Brill's car's engineer. Here's a shot. Here's the station looking down into Shavertown. I believe this is the feed store of this building. Here's an overview of Shavertown from the Tremperskill Road. So heading west out of the town, the rails curved around a bend of the East Branch. So that's this location here. And then came the Rock Eddy Bridge, another two-span truss bridge. And here's a shot. I believe this is shortly after the Rock Eddy Bridge was completed. So a DN Delaware and Eastern locomotive with some crew posed on the bridge at Rock Eddy. So the next stop along the Delaware Northern was Pepacton, aptly now below the Pepacton Reservoir. So Pepacton was actually the original name of the East Branch of the Delaware River was originally called the Pepacton Branch of the Delaware River. So Pepacton was a very tiny hamlet of about 25 people. Nevertheless, the Delaware and Eastern constructed a creamery here, which was later sold to Borden's. There was a second creamery here owned by Breakstone, and also a feed store. So very tiny hamlet, but a lot of activity going on for the dairy industry in the area. Here's a modern map. This is right around where 206 meets Route 30, just east of Downsville. So 206 is the road that heads down to Roscoe. Here's a shot of the Pepacton station, very similar to Shavertown. Kind of cheaply built on these stone piers. That's Berry Brook Road crossing behind the station there. Here's the Borden's Creamery. This was originally the Delaware and Eastern Creamery that the railroad built for the area. One of several that the Delaware and Eastern built. So this is number 4 on the Delaware Northern, one of the original Lackawanna engines purchased by the D&E. Here's the Pepacton Station. There's a feed store here on the right. So interesting story about number 4. There was actually a picture posted in the Middletown Historical Society, not the city of Middletown, the Middletown in Delaware County. Apparently, I don't know what happened, but there's a picture of Delaware Northern number 4, and it looks like it had a boiler explosion. But I've yet to find any information about that. So next, heading down the line, we're now out of the Pepacton Reservoir and have reached the community of Downsville. So the Downsville Dam is like right around here, and then the village of Downsville is over here. And then the station was located over here on the other side of the river. So back in those days, Downsville, along with Margaretville, were probably the biggest communities along the main line. Downsville had about 700 residents. The D&E constructed another creamery at Downsville, which was later sold to Borden's when the D&E went under. Later, that became part of Breakstone Brothers. The village also housed the Eagle Hotel, the Downs House, an opera house, and a public library. The depot at Downsville was located on the south side of the East Branch and is now a private dwelling today. And then further west, I'm sorry, was a little flag stop of Colchester. Colchester was actually the name of the town that we're in, but was only just a little flag stop on the railroad. So here's an overview of the town of Downsville. In the early newspaper articles about the Delaware and Eastern Railroad, there's a lot of talk about when Frederick Searing, Joseph German, and R.B. Williams came up to Downsville on a tour inspection of the valley. And the Downsville residents just kind of paid them no mind. They really had no interest in railroads at that point because there had been so many surveyors and false promises of railroads coming through the valley. And the Delaware and Eastern was all privately funded. They didn't ask any of the towns along the East Branch Valley to bond themselves to build a railroad, which the valley residents appreciated. So here's Downsville Station. Simple runaround and a long track for the creamery here. In Archer's map here, it shows a water plug, but there was actually a water tank at Downsville, which I believe was the only water tank built between Margaretville and East Branch. Here's the Downsville Station, one of the bigger stations along the railroad. Again, now private dwelling. Another shot of the station. Here's a shot of number 5, one of the original D&E engines purchased in Lackawanna, down at Downsville Station. Here's the creamery at Downsville, looking at Caddy Corner from the station. There's the creamery, Downsville Station, and the Brill car. All right, heading further west, Corbett was the site of a large wood acid factory that belonged to the Corbett and Stewart Company. Corbett itself was a company town, basically built for the acid factory. There were several different sidings here that served the factory, and by 1920, more than 45 homes, company homes, were located at Corbett. So Corbett and Stewart built their acid factory in Corbett, kind of consolidating several other factories in the area to this one location. The factory was actually so busy that they had their own plant switcher, which was a little shay locomotive that was used to switch the plant. Rumor has it is that on days the DNN didn't run, they would run the shay locomotive down to East Branch to pick up a carload of coal from the Ontario and Western. The Corbett and Stewart plant closed in 1934. Basically, it was no longer economical to operate the plant. They had basically stripped all the mountains of all their lumber for a sizable distance, and trucking and bringing in wood from a distance was expensive. Also in 1934, there was a freezing episode at the plant, which kind of damaged the plant beyond economical repair. So the plant's closure was really a huge loss. The DNN, Corbett and Stewart plant was the biggest customer on the railroad. And after that, the DNN basically only ran 3 days a week and then slowly ran even less. Sometimes it only ran once every other week. Past Corbett was Gregorytown, which is just a very, very small hamlet and a flag stop. There was a passing siding and a team track evidently located here. Beyond that was the little commuted hamlet of Shinhopple, which is actually named after a shrub, which was just a little hamlet of about 30 people located in a sharp bend of the East Branch. Shinhopple actually originated a lot of bluestone traffic for the DNN, which was used mainly to ship, which was mainly shipped to New York City for use as sidewalks and building construction. So here's a map of the track plan at Corbett. The company store at Corbett is actually still there, which actually doubled as the Corbett station. And then the acid factory was located back here. So here's a shot of the Corbett and Stewart factory. Here's a DNN train coming up the tracks. Another shot of the factory. Here's a pretty good overview of the whole community of Corbett. The DNN tracks pass this way. This is the main, and then all the siding tracks went this way. Here's the company store, which was basically very immediately parallel to the main line and doubled as the train station for Corbett. This building is still there, so it's pretty. If you go to Corbett today, you can still see where the tracks went and kind of how this all was situated. So here's the intrepid Corbett and Stewart shay that was used. It didn't always look this bad, but one of the neat things is apparently the original stack fell apart, so they repurposed an old water heater as the stack, which was kind of interesting. So here's a map of the tracks at Shinhopple. So there's a little passing siding or a little runaround. And then there's also a depressed siding and basically a trough that was used to load cut stone. So here's the station at Shinhopple. Being as how there was only a handful of residents in Shinhopple, they did not keep a station agent here for very long. It was eventually the agency was abolished at some point. But the railroad, as a courtesy to its patrons that did use the station, did keep a coal stove here going in the cold months. And apparently, that was not a good idea because the unattended coal stove set the whole station on fire in 1924. So the whole station burned down. And the DNN, being in receivership at that point, could not afford to build a whole new station and just built this little shed for whatever passengers remained. So here's a shot of a train at Shinhopple. So here's all that stone waiting to be loaded. Here's that depressed siding that was used to load stone on flat cars to ship out. Here's another shot of that. So it was a pretty big business, stone cutting um, in the East Branch Valley. Heading further west, you get to Long Flat. Long Flat was listed as a flag stop on a DNN timetable. The tracks were actually located across the river from the Long Flat school, and there was no bridge here, so I'm not entirely sure what the situation was here. Um, I'm not sure if you got off at Long Flat, how you'd get across the river to the school. Um, Heading further west was the little hamlet of Harvard, which is located across the river from the station. There was a wood acid factory here earlier on before everything was consolidated up to Corbett. So that closed down around 1910. There was also a sawmill, general store, post office, and some small farms. The station had a small team track for whatever little traffic originated here. The hamlet had about 100 residents when the acid factory closed. Today, the Harvard Depot still exists. I believe it's like a hunting lodge today. So here's a picture of the Harvard station. And here's an overview of the very, very little hamlet of Harvard. And then finally, the DNN main line wound up in East Branch, which is where the DNN connected with the main line of the Ontario and Western. The DNN shared the O&W's depot, which had opened in 1873 and closed with the abandonment of the O&W in 1957. East Branch was a hamlet of about 600 people, situated where the Beaver Kill, which is the river here, met the East Branch of the Delaware River, which is how the town got its name. There were several sawmills located around East Branch, and the DNN actually a little upriver from here served Jim Hubbell's sawmill with a siding. DNN also served a feed store right around this area. There was a Y here and interchange track. So here's a bird's eye view of East Branch. Here's a map of East Branch from Harry Archer's book. So the DNN crossed here over the Beaver Kill. I'll show you a picture of the bridge in just a second. There were two tracks in the Y. There was this south Y leg and then a bypass. Some interchange tracks over here, a crossover, which is how the O&W reached the interchange to grab the DNN's interchange car. There's a feed store here. The DNN trains would basically pull up to here to allow passengers to get off and transfer at the O&W station for O&W trains. And there was a water plug over here to allow DNN locomotives to grab water for the trip back up towards Margaretville and Arkville. All right, so here's the twin span bridge that crossed over the Beaver Kill. So on the one side of the bridge, I believe on the eastern side, there was a long set of trestle work, wooden trestle work that was later filled in during around World War One. So here's a picture of that activity going on now in this picture. DNN number 5 with a New York Central dump car. So you can actually see in this earlier shot. So here is the twin span bridge going over the Beaver Kill. And over here is all that trestle work that got filled in later on. I believe over here is that house that you saw in that picture, in the last picture. So here's DNN number 1 at East Branch. This is one of the Southern Indiana engines that was purchased in 1911. I believe it ran up until 33. Here's another shot of DNN number 1 with a mixed train, some milk cars, and some passenger cars meeting the O&W at East Branch. Another shot of East Branch. Here's the DNN's water plug right here. So the DNN's tail track would have been right in here in the weeds. Here's another shot of East Branch, O&W freight coming through. This is after the O&W removed the second mainline track. And then over here is the drill car. So beyond the main line was the 9 mile branch that headed up the Tremperskill to Andes, which was abandoned in 1925. The branch cost a lot of money to build. It was fairly steep. Um, caused a lot of. It did not generate ton of traffic for the DNN, which is why it was abandoned so early in 1925. Um, Here's what it looks like today. So kind of this thumb of the Pepacton comes up this far, and then a lot of the grade still exists. So there's a few little stops on the way to Andes. The first was a little stop at Pleasant Valley, which there was a little depot located there, which is pictured right here. Past Pleasant Valley was more trestle. This is another picture I was able to pick up on eBay. There were two large trestles on the Andes branch, which are very similarly named. There was the Moore trestle, which is pictured here. I'm not sure if it's Moore or More. More is a very popular name up in this area. There was the Moore family in Grand Gorge, so it might have been More. And further up the tracks was the Muir trestle, which is spelled Muir. So these two bridges get confused for each other a lot in paperwork and old photos. But this is the Moore trestle. Here's another shot of the Moore trestle. So past Pleasant Valley, you got the stops of Wolf Hollow and Kaufman's. Unfortunately, no pictures of Wolf Hollow seem to have ever surfaced, so I'm not sure if there was a depot there or not. This is kind of what it looks like today along the Tremperskill Road. Here's a postcard view. This is early on in the history of the Delaware and Eastern. This was a payday. So back in those days, there was a pay car that would travel the railroad and basically just drop off people's payment for that pay period. So it's kind of a big event. So everyone would gather and wait for the pay car to show up with their week's pay. So here's Kaufman's, which is a little depot at Fowler's Crossing. So here's the grade crossing back here, and then there was this big cut beyond. Here's another shot of Kaufman's at Fowler's Crossing. So beyond Kaufman's, the tracks curved, and there was Muir trestle, and they curved back up towards Andes. There was also a spur here that headed up towards this pond. I believe that was used for ice cutting or ice collection in the winter. So back in the day, before mechanical refrigeration, you had to harvest ice in the winter to use for the rest of the year to keep your food cold. So I believe that's what this spur was used for. So here's a modern aerial view. So here's the Muir trestle, which was on a curve and was much larger than Moore trestle. So here's a shot of the DNN train on Muir trestle, which is only a very small portion of the overall trestle in this picture. So around World War One, when the DNN was filling in those trestle work at East Branch, they were also filling in the Muir trestle and I believe the Moore trestle as well, which was a huge expense. They also built this huge culvert that went through where the trestle was being filled in. So this is a huge job, required a lot of dedicated train, all these side dump cars, a lot of work, and a lot of investment. Here's that big culvert now, or big culvert. That culvert is still there. I don't know who's maintaining it or what, but still carrying the stream through the embankment. Here's a shot of that work train filling up side dump cars with fill, which is excavated locally to dump over the side and fill in the trestle. So the old Lackawanna engines, the old D&E engines, found a lot of use in work train service. So this is D&E number DNN number 6, one of the original D&E locomotives being used to fill in Muir trestle. The Andes branch was also known for its wrecks on the DNN in total. The reason that the DNN was called the Dam Nuisance was for all of its wrecks. So this is an early wreck, one of the early bobber cabooses that the DNE and purchased. This is actually a locomotive over on its side, somewhere up on the Andes branch. So then he finally got up into Andes. Andes is a decently sized village located not too far from the county seat of Delhi. There had been several failed plans to connect Andes either to Delhi or Margaretville by a railroad since the 1870s. The Delhi and Middletown, which was that failed project that I mentioned earlier, was supposed to come through here. The town of Andes actually carried a bonded indebtedness for the Delhi and Middletown, which failed in 1873, and they didn't pay off that debt until the 1930s. Um, um, that railroad project failed in 1873, and it wasn't until 1907 that the D&E finally got to Andes. Because Andes is a very mountainous area, the town was named in reference to the South American mountain range, the Andes. And then rail service to Andes ended in 1925. So there were two creameries on the railroad at Andes. There was the railroad's own creamery and the Andes Co-op. A third creamery owned by the Dairymen's League was located on the opposite side of the Tremperskill and did not have direct rail access. There was also a feed store, which I believe was owned by the Archers. The railroad station and terminal was located on a hillside just outside of the village on Cabin Hill Road. Due to topography, Andes did not have a Y to turn locomotives, and so there was a turntable located on the west end of the yard to turn engines to head back down towards Andes Junction. So here's a shot of the Andes station, pretty typical design for the railroad stations on the Delaware Northern. The station still exists. It has been restored by the local historical society and is open as a museum, which is really great because the Andes branch literally stopped running this month 100 years ago. So it's great that the station still exists. This is the Delaware and Eastern Creamery at Andes. Here's the Andes Co-op Creamery. And with that, that brings us to the end of the tour of the railroad and the end of my presentation. So I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. I have droned on for quite a while. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat. So to answer some of the questions, Bob, I see you dropped in a couple of questions. I don't know what the color of the stations were because the railroad stopped running in 1942, so there weren't really any color pictures, but hopefully that'll show up in some research. The destination of the milk for all these creameries was really generally towards the New York City market. Generally. How frequent were the passenger trains? So for the second half of the history of the railroad, before the Andes branch was discontinued, the train would originate in Andes, come down the mountain, down the Tremperskill, head up towards Arkville, turn at Arkville, head back down the whole length of the main line to East Branch, leave East Branch, go back all the way to Arkville, turn at Arkville, and head back up to Andes. And then after the Andes branch was discontinued, I believe they started the train out in either Shavertown or Downsville. I'm not sure offhand. Comments. Thank you all for your comments. I very much appreciate it. Hope you looked forward if we enjoyed it. Another question: when were the last residents of the town now submerged on the Pepacton Reservoir finally forced to leave? Well, basically, they had to clear the whole entire valley floor of everything before the reservoir came and before the valley started flooding. They even paid valley residents to relocate graves out of the bottom of the valley. which is very morbid to think about. There's a picture somewhere in one of the local history books of them removing the Shavertown post office sign. I believe it was 53 or 54 when that happened, that they finally had to leave. Um, see if there's any more questions. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Our next presentation will be the second Thursday in April. That will be Steve Barry joining us, giving a presentation of his photography. Hope to see you there in person. This presentation has been recorded and will be posted up on YouTube in the next few days. I sincerely hope you all enjoyed it. I hope everyone has a good night, and thank you for joining.